Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 3. The dwindling party of Bosporans encamped in the First Lands would have perished during the winter of 202 had it not been for the aid of the so-called Leuthosis Manus, a name the forest people on the edge of the Daylight Realms claimed for themselves. It sounded exonymic, and it was not unheard of for some among frontier people to adopt the names that influential cultures had bequeathed upon them. These days it is debated on occasion if it was connected to the languages of the Italics, or even, some said, the crass script known as Demotic, used in some places in Egypt. Such commentators know nothing of the matter, as I will later show. These people intimidated the Bosporans greatly when they came to the ruined city. It was the same instinctive fear that had struck the lesser steppe peoples, fear of what the people from the world of darkness might truly be behind their human facade. In truth, they were not so unusual. Diotrephes described them as follows. Their appearance was recognizable yet foreign, possessing the strong cheeks of the steppe peoples, yet the dull skin and wide eyes of the southern Greeks. They were dark with tattoos, even among their lowest ranks, and likewise it appeared that none of them were called slaves. On the contrary, they despised the practice as an affront to Zeus, being that they appeared to know Zeus differently to our people. Regretfully, this divergence fascinated the prince to a bloody end. His latter comment we shall attend to shortly. Suffice to say, no such peoples had been seen before by any who took the time to describe them over the coming years, although they were not beyond the sight of the gods. Led by a woman named Gwenna, whose Greek was so erudite as to shame some of the prince's companions, these people came by the thousands to the snow-capped Bosporan camp. Their vast entourage of horses and cattle, so shy as to turn away from the sun whenever they could, brought sustenance to the collective during the winter, and they freely shared their bounty with the otherwise stranded Bosporans, including their overly popular intoxicating drafts. This was a cruel bargain of sorts, for much was ultimately asked of in return. To understand their reasoning, we must permit ourselves to recount what the Lithosis still knew of their own ancient history, which, as you will see, informed their motivations in these current events strongly. It is said that this information first came to be known through a long poem that Gwenna Greek-speaker performed on the eve of her people's arrival, one so enrapturing for the Bosporans that their opposition to said arrival was stifled. While the precise verse is unknown, I shall paraphrase the countless retellings of this story that came to be recorded around this time. The first lands were created, one way or another, by a god called Manos, who ceased to be a god in the effort. This method to create the world and create life relied on a simple form of magic that was passed down among all mankind: sacrifice. The spilling of blood filled oceans, and the withering of flesh nourished the earth. What he sacrificed was a matter of contention the Lithosis wished to resolve through engagement of the prince, as I shall explain shortly. Indeed, the full tale was a boon available only to those living in the first times, which was when all was in order and all men knew righteousness and justice without imperfection. This is what later histories would call the Golden Age, although the Lithosis had no time for any Greek description of this era, dismissing it outright. This was because of a strong prejudice they held against all cultures that deviated from their own, stemming from the shrouded events that caused the Golden Age to collapse. All that is certain is that humankind began to deviate from the path the former god Manos had set out for the earth, and that blood and flesh lost their powers to forever rejuvenate life. The all-tribe of the Golden Age was split into warring factions by false kings, who ultimately left the First Lands and became, they claimed, the multitude of separate peoples one can find in the world. They became what the Lithosis called half-men, and those loyal to Manos had no concept of forgiveness for those lineages even after thousands of years. Such bone-carved hatred I have never seen the like of, and only their link to the legend of Manos allowed them to maintain such darkness over 100 generations. That is not to say they revelled in it. They wished to see themselves lifted of a burden that knowing the downfall of all things placed upon them, and that was no small part of their motivation in pressing the supposed half-man Pairisades into action. Note that here I omitted the large body of the story that was purely myth of recent invention. In time I shall relay the true course of events. The accurate portion relayed here was based purely on a single runestone that the Lithosis had treasured for thousands of years. Thus we approach their thirst for truth, and indeed their thirst for the same divine knowledge that had tempted Pairisades to the furthest wastelands. They believed that when their civilization had been scattered 3,000 years ago, there had been many runestones sent out with the various strands of their people. This was, supposedly, the time when lands outside of the steppe were only beginning to form, although some of my peers contest this notion powerfully on account of records of Nile peoples purporting to extend back far further. Whichever the case, the finding of these additional runestones was Gwenna's stated purpose in leading her tribes from the forest, and she was thus pinning this project onto Pairisades. It is not clear whether he was given a choice in the matter, but his character was conducive to this employment above all others. There were plenty among the Bosporans who rejected the young crone's words and her demands, perhaps most of them. In one example of this, Diotrephes slew a man who brandished a weapon against the prince, and is said to have wept over the affair in clear demonstration of his own conflict. Who couldn't have felt the gods tugging on their heart in such a circumstance? Perhaps the only one who saw clearly to their own future was Pairisades himself. To him, the tale of Manos was not so unbelievable, as he was willing to believe whatever the gods revealed to him there, no matter how he found it or it found him. Remember that in this case, he had actually been told a great many things that were untrue, which I omitted as noted above. And when Gwenna asked that he send troops far and wide to locate additional runestones, he agreed readily. There was more to his plan too. As spring broke, he gathered up those most eager to return to the Black Sea, and entrusted them with reports for King Spartacus. Those that stayed were gifted further tents and wagons from the Leuthosis, and were joined to the ever-growing encampment around the ruins, which the Leuthosis called Kariskos. The Lithosis did not return to their supposed realm in the deep woods, and were beginning to fortify the site. They constantly ferried lumber from their forest for that purpose, and more. Pairisades had the remaining Greeks join in, and they quickly established their own name for the camp, Kariskos, which is what it's most commonly called today. The party sent to Spartacus had completed no more than a quarter of their 3 months of travel before they were stopped by a sizable column of armed riders with no caravan. They turned out to be utterly lost in their pursuit of Pairisades, and revealed that they had a vast trove of gifts they intended to deliver as a signal of supplication. This surprising offer was the order of Eumenes, High Chief of the Heloni tribes, the same peoples who had previously scattered in fear upon approaching the first lands. This new expedition had fared scarcely better. But trusting their intentions, the Bosporans sent them towards Kariskos. The later events of the expedition to Tanais shall be discussed shortly. Being purely on horseback, the Heloni arrived within 2 days, and immediately the ambassadors presented a spread of riches that had both Pairisades and Gwenna instantly sold on anything they might request in return. The only request was to hear what Gwenna knew of the creation of the world, and she was more than happy to sing her myth song again. To explain this strange behavior from Eumenes and his people, we must first know that his intentions began in the simple desire for profit. Hearing of the Scythian horde hunting for a lost stone, the river folk had made considerable effort to ensure some dividend of the quest was paid to them. Through those who had defected from Pairisades' cause in the autumn, they had learned not only of the rough direction of the prince's quest, but that it was runes on the Scythian stone that made it valuable, runes relating to the very essence of the world and the wishes of its gods. This alerted the wittier among them to the fact that over many generations, the river tribes had come to possess various ancient runestones through trade. Since then, they had, in most cases, been ensconced on royal wagons or distinguished tombs. It was generally considered that the runes were decorative or otherwise meaningless. The affairs of the previous year promised they were anything but. In truth, many of their runestones were artistic imitations with no meaning, yet not all. Ignorant but hungry, the Heloni's leading chiefs decided to pursue whatever profit the mad Greeks sought in the north by ferrying the stones hence. Once Eumenes heard the song of the Dark Ones of the Deepwood, he was convinced to leave an embassy in Kariskos and arrange caravans to bring materials and colonists from downriver. Pairisades was eager to agree, and the Lithosis called out that he was a worthy king upon confirmation of this de facto supplication. Such things infuriated most of the Greeks, although Pairisades played it off as a joke. Eumenes and company left happy and humble. Gwenna hoarded the delivered stones and began to transcribe what meaning she could find. At this time we should relay the basics of what the sanctioned king, Spartacus, had achieved. Here supplication was had also. After news of Chersonesus spread far and wide, the lesser colonies of the Black Sea's eastern coast had sent tribute to Tanais, and all but surrendered responsibility for their defense against the nomads to the Spartakids, demonstrating that despite their apparent downfall, their prestige remained foremost in the region among the civilized peoples. Spartacus had graciously accepted co-kingship of Anacopeia to the south, an arrangement that brought colonists to Tanais in greater numbers than could reasonably be accommodated. Fortunately, there was a disproportionate concentration of slaves in the city due to the disbanding of ships' crews upon arrival, with more arriving in a caravan from Gelonis carrying welcome news of Pairisades' discovery of the first lands. The consequences of this mixing of worlds were soon to emerge. In Kariskos, there came a time when promises that the words of the gods would be delivered to the Greeks matured and demanded action. For some, this had already been delivered upon, and this illustrates vital division among the Bosporans. Some, like the prince, looked upon the legend of Manos and the promise of further elucidations there as the object of their quest, enhanced only by the promise that the Heloni Trove would produce more sacred verses. Others, like one leading companion named Olympos, wished to hear news from the gods of Greece. With a brief understanding of Leuthosis Manus religion, one will appreciate that this was impossible. Allow me to explain. While some say the Lithosis had many gods, there were in fact very few. The confusion stems from the way in which they saw the godliness of everyday things usually considered mundane to other peoples. They would say that such peoples have simply forgotten something that is, on the face of it, obvious, that being the greatness of the distinction between that which is and that which wouldn't be were it not for the foresight of Manos. I should point out here, to avoid subsequent confusion, that one must be mindful of the distinction between Manos, the name of the first god of the world, and the word Manus, simply meaning people. The full title, Leuthosis Manus, can be understood to mean free forest people, free bone people, tree-loving people, or according to some, angry tree people. Between the holiness of all things, there were several entities that we might call gods, although the term fits them poorly. Chief among them were Deus and Degom, associated with the sky and the earth respectively, and some say with male and female, although the more primitive Lithosis language had no structure to distinguish between those categories for inhuman things. Deus was their name for Zeus, in effect, whereas Degom was understood to be the Greek god Demeter or the cult idol Semele. If the Lithosis Manus knew of gods such as these, how could their religion be so hard to understand? Conflict arose because they insisted that most other known gods were merely corruptions, mistakes, inventions. All manner of sacrilegious words flowed from the ink-crossed mouth of Gwenna Greek-speaker. Furthermore, even the select list of deities she was willing to recognize were withheld courtesies, for the gods they understood were, contrastingly, not gods. The notion of a god was reserved for what Manos had once been, considered beings so far from outside the boundary of the world that they had little or no connection to it at all, or perhaps even a hostile relationship. Deus and Degom were deities of a kind that Gwenna explained to the Greeks through reference to the works of Plato, with which none were familiar enough to appreciate. The connection was that these worldly gods were beings who existed in the realm of Platonic ideal, said to be where abstractions, for example attributes of colours or shapes, manifest in a material form, such that their nature can be non-ethereal. This is what allows the likes of men to conceive of these things in our view of the world. So it was with Deus and Degom, beings that carried the power of creation and the memory of humankind's ideal qualities set out at the dawn of the Golden Age. They could not be worshipped. Instead, they were invoked such that imperfect observers might approach their power through imitation. This practice fascinated the prince to a maddening degree, and can be seen as the root of a great many of his behaviours to follow. To complete the point, the words of the god that the Lithosis runestones were rumoured to bear were unlikely to be of any use to a devotee of almost any cult or temple that existed at that time. Rather, they were words passed down from the earliest beings, some gods, some paragons, some mere men. However, they were true words nonetheless, and the value of knowing them was beyond comprehension. I say this confidently now, yet in those times it was not at all obvious that this was the case. In fact, it was a minority view among the Bosporans that the prince should indulge Gwenna's entreaties, or that they should in turn indulge their prince. With the gods watching closely, it is no wonder that swords were drawn over this matter. The aforementioned companion Olympos was ringleader of the dissenters. They were not content to simply desert their posts, going so far as to steal some of the Heloni trove to fund their journey hence. This was a dire miscalculation, for they had no more than 100 fighters to their cause, and thousands of Lithosis riders made a smothering pursuit. Among them was Pairisades, who gave the order to kill his followers and recover the stones so coldly that Diotrephes claimed it was sensible that he wished to recover those mystic pieces, for they were his kin. He and they were stoned together. The deserters were surrounded and given no chance to surrender. The quick Lithosis riders loosed arrows at full pace and used lances to unhorse any foes that caught up. Such was the tradition in steppe warfare. Unusual, though, was their treatment of the fallen. Those killed on either side were dragged around by the horses in a strange ritual, throughout which the living appeared not mournful or disgusted by the day's events, but delighted. Asking after the practice, Pairisades learned that this was the blood ritual of rejuvenation, using spilled blood to enhance the spirit of the earth, emulating holy Dagon, for earth was empowered to exist by offerings of man. It would have been deemed barbaric had it not been, in retrospect, quite correct. Diotrephes was among those leaning against this, and the Lithosis spiritual culture in general. Upon returning to Kariskos, he challenged Gwenna, saying, "Why do you hide from the world and worship in that land of darkness if the will of the gods is so clear to you?" To which came the reply, "You do not know what it was that brought this city down from its height. You know not whose blood fertilized the grass sea and gave birth to the lands you call home. It was our people that made your gods. This was the dire mistake that our sacrifices in this age will undo. That is the destiny of your king." Gwenna still referred to Pairisades by the rank of king, and it remained at least officially rejected. He was, in effect, governor of the growing settlement at Kariskos, of which the Lithosis were de facto subjects. Therefore, in some ways, his responsibilities and independence had become indeed like that of a king. For the Lithosis, this term implied much more than these qualities, and we shall cover this in detail later. There came now a period of rest in which both the colonies at Kariskos and Tanais, twin capitals of the Bosporan kingdom, were rapidly developed by their newly arrived populations. Kariskos received embassies from minor steppe tribes, pledging tribute and colonists to the venture, to the surprise of the Greeks. The influence that the emergence of the Lithosis into local politics had had was great, for it struck at many prophecies and fears of the lesser tribes, and perhaps awakened in them memories of the common ancestors they shared with those bloodthirsty and righteous forest people. This was demonstrated most clearly when an exhausted party of Scythians made their approach. Pairisades knew its leaders personally, not as friends but as enemies. These were the chiefs who had discovered the fateful runestone. They came to surrender to Kariskos as if they had been defeated in a great battle, offering wagons of stone and lumber sourced from nowhere else than Chersonesus, brought into the first lands via unimaginable effort and expense. Greek slaves too were offered, of which most Pairisades freed, enriching Kariskos with craftsmen and industrialists who not only began to plan city walls, but demonstrated to the prejudicial Lithosis what achievements so-called half-men had wrought during the full men's long sojourn in the deep woods. However, their foremost works of art, their temples, were forbidden by order of the prince. This made the Greeks feel imposed upon by the Lithosis, and was a source of endless unease and conflict. But the regular conflict with the tribes of the steppe and Black Sea coast seemed to have been extinguished, as if the will of the gods themselves had made itself known to these people, and a broad coalition was entered into, with Kariskos at its axle. During this time, the primary project of the city was to restore regular contact with Tanais, and by the lights of the prince, transfer the kingdom's resources to his new bastion. With the overland route being long and rarely travelled, a riverine link was proposed by the Heloni. They knew of various ancient waterways that spread out from the river Tanais all the way to the World's Edge forest, and in turn there were several rivers whose sources were in close proximity to Kariskos that eventually widened enough for commercial activities. This, one imagines, was the source of the city's power and prominence during the Golden Age. Through charting the first lands in detail, a regular route was established, whereby caravans would travel primarily to the east for several weeks, then meet the uppermost reaches of the Tanais. From here, the waters could ferry them towards the Black Sea via a winding, unspoilt route. Scouting the banks of the young river revealed further ruins and pillars of Golden Age origin, hinting at towns and cities long forgotten. Pairisades came to tour these sites personally, and at the largest site found, Pairisades founded a riverside town named Silis, which also was what the Heloni called this river, and it is a testament to the surplus labour and materials that were flowing into Kariskos that he was able to commit to a similar remote colony at the same time. It was the winter of the year 200 when the first two riverboats ferried a collection of diplomats and overseers to Tanais, meeting en route a migrating people called the Alani, said to be tens of thousands strong, and demanding they send tribute upriver before crossing it. Territorial claims were hard to impose on the steppe, yet the Alani indeed paid tribute, and ultimately only pastured on the west bank for a single season. The presence of an organised government in the region intrigued them, and they would return to their distant ranges in Asia with the thought of it troubling their hearts. At Tanais, Spartacus received all arrivals from the north personally in order to interrogate them for all details he could. He did not perform well, as his own writings indicate he came away with only a brief overview of what had transpired. To him, his brother had allied to an unknown tribe and in some way negotiated peace with most of the other steppe peoples, and now called for colonists and resources to be diverted to him. Furthermore, he had been dishonouring the gods and mistreating the people in service of his ambition. Whether this is an unfair or inaccurate picture of things, I shall leave for you to decide. Spartacus decided that it required his personal attention, and in turn that he ought to acquiesce to his brother's demands. After all, he too had received diplomats from various tribes, coming to arrangements that enhanced the security and economic potential of Tanais greatly. Therefore, it should not be said that nothing was being achieved in the north from the point of view of the king. At this time, then, Spartacus began to organize a colonial venture to bring people from Tanais and Anacopeia to Silis, securing the middle link between his own and his brother's colonies. Since he did not trust the Heloni, he chose to take a lengthy overland route, taking all the wagons and horses he could muster from his vassal tribes, and a good portion of Tanais' freedman population. This only further increased the proportion of those that remained who were slaves, and while ordinarily a king might be expected to use royal command to achieve manumission of new freedmen, Spartacus was too strict to do so without the usual period of service being rendered, a minimum of 6 years for Greeks and 10 years for other peoples. Since this eliminated such a large pool of the slave body, he decided to free none of them in order to prevent any ill feeling among those left in bondage. Suffice to say that if avoiding ill feeling was his intent, this decision was irreconcilable with reason. As if the course of events he was setting was not obvious, the gods sent a legion of grey spectres who besieged the king's camp one night and outright demanded that they all return home and play no part in Pairisades' folly. What force precisely was behind this omen is unclear, although there were many gods who could sense their position in the world being undermined by the return of the Lithosis. Spartacus dismissed the omens as readily as Pairisades would have done had he been in command, and hence who can say whether one brother was truly more foolhardy than the other. The political climate of the steppe had now changed from a stew of rivalries and fear into one of coalition helmed by an outside force, an unheard of arrangement that cannot be described without imagining a great campaign of conquest being at the heart of it, although none had occurred. or none had occurred in the last 3,000 years. One might wish to claim, with a sense of irony, that campaigns fought at the close of the Golden Age could be said to be bearing fruit now that a like time was once again beginning to intersect with the world. I, for one, would not speculate in this way. The important effect of the coalition was that it essentially forced the hand of all those who might oppose it to coalesce themselves. And that is how the Bosporans of Kariskos understood the situation. 2 in every 3 tribes had pledged to aid or at least respect the city, and 1 in 3 vowed that they would demonstrate their opposition by force. Where any potential battle lines were being drawn is almost impossible to tell, being that a would-be state of war was emerging with forces whose location, strength, and general intent were likely hardly known to even those closely involved in their affairs. The first record of what these declarations meant was surprisingly made by the chroniclers in Spartacus's retinue, who wrote that their colonial venture, after great stress, had approached Silis in the summer of 198, only to find it had been conquered by a panoply of Sarmatians and stray Greeks, holding it to ransom to advocate for the political freedom of the nomads and the honor of the gods, respectively. No sooner had Spartacus's scouts ahead discovered this, did he receive news coming from behind that Tanais had fallen into the hands of a despot, and that it was none other than his appointed viceroy, the so-called first citizen Herodotus. He had united the slaves and joined their cause to his own bid for military power, and as such not only had the slaves been freed, but Tanais too could be said to be free from the kingdom that founded it. With so much of his journey complete, Spartacus could hardly turn back to attend to these matters, and furthermore, if he wished to fight to hold on to his kingdom, there was battle of this kind closer at hand to his front. So it was that in autumn, his colonists made camp and prepared weapons within view of Silis, the wooden citadel of which was on a hill beside the river, although most of the town was scattered around in a markedly unfinished state. The morning after their arrival, Spartacus drew up for battle. Before he was done, the Silis garrison came out on horses and charged into the mass of colonists. Ordinarily, this might have succeeded. However, Spartacus had carefully picked and prepared his men, such that they were all armed with at least 2 short spears and a tall shield that the Greeks called a thyrios. While they were poorly armoured, they had been trained daily for the rigours of colonial life, and that in no small part included military drill. Therefore, they created a screen of shields 5 men deep in front of their camp, their white shields appearing like a cliff before the galloping horses. When riders came close, spears were hurled towards them to further dissuade attack, and soon any hope the bandits had of a quick victory was dashed. Then Spartacus carefully approached the town with his colonists maintaining their shield walls, although it was disorderly and nothing comparable to a phalanx. Behind, he brought up his Cimmerian allies, who were not subjected to his colonial training, but possessed natural skill with their light arms. The rebels, be they on foot or on horse, found that arrows, javelins, stones, and shaming calls bombarded them without relent. Some tried to escape back into the town, while others attempted to charge through the danger and use their axes and swords in close combat. In either case, the majority were either killed or soon ceased to resemble any kind of defending force, and hence Silis came into Spartacus's control. His colonists set to work immediately, carrying out the work that Pairisades' men had started, but Spartacus had his focus elsewhere. He wished to identify the tribal allies Pairisades had made, who had evidently been present at Silis, and understand whether he could be at ease in lands that all tribes he had ever known claimed were too dangerous and barren to inhabit. Fortunately, word of his achievements at Silis was transmitted to Kariskos quickly by watchful Lithosis outriders, and Pairisades sent a short, impolite letter that promised future assurances, instead spending the present time to announce that war was upon his new city, and he had, by his own count, fewer than 20 of his original companions left. This was not a request for aid, rather a boast. He was setting the stage for his victories in battles to come, and underplaying the significance of the thousands of Leuthosis Manus warriors who might reasonably aid him. Such is the nature of a younger brother's style of communication with an elder. At this time, then, it was the case that any territories that might still be called the Bosporan Kingdom existed entirely in the abandoned First Lands, and their population was mostly foreign, not only to them, but to every other society within memory. The world was going to become more familiar with them shortly, and none faster than the gathering bands of steppe nomads, the anti-Golden Age coalition, some call them now, who were tracking their way towards Kariskos with the intention of seizing whatever power was growing there for themselves. If only they had known that Prince Pairisades still had almost 20 men, and moreover the formula of worldly power. The first lands had been built by the flesh of Manos, and could be rebuilt with the flesh of man.